CGI America. But given what happened over the weekend in Orlando, I'd want to spend a minute on that, as I'm sure you would as well. And I'll be a little personal at this because when I was running ABC News, I remember after Columbine, we came down and you did a live 2-hour program with your wife, if you recall, with a town meeting. And I remember how emotional that was and how difficult it was. In that job, when there's been tragedies, huge tragedies hit the country, what can we do to avoid this going forward?
Well, first of all, we need more help with intelligence work with federal and local law enforcement, with people who may be lone wolves. It's like those people at San Bernardino. They were converted to their ideology over the internet. Today, we still don't know all. I think we'll eventually learn about the man who killed all the people in Orlando. But it's, you know, there are all kinds of crazy theories floating around now, but it does seem pretty clear that some of the people who were in touch with him beforehand, perhaps even in his own family, knew he was going to do something, whether they knew this or not. So we've got to get better at that, and our fellow to help us, because you have to take it seriously. And people, just like it's also true in other areas. Like a lot of people miss clear signs of suicides, and this is something new. This sort of, you know, you can go down to your friendly store and get an AR-15 and wipe out a bunch of people. We need tighter security on that. And then I think the other things that Hillary said in her speech yesterday are accurate too. The other things we can do to harden our defenses at home and increase our efforts around the world to defeat ISIS and other radical groups. But I kept thinking over and over, the more I hear about this, is, you know, I was glad to hear the FBI director saying he was constantly asking himself, is there something else we should have done at some point in this chain of events that would have done it? That's what every American should ask. And we just got to all be on a higher alert. You can't ignore someone you think is ranting and raving. They may be serious.
So you mentioned what Secretary Clinton, one of the presumptive candidates, said yesterday. We've also had the other presumptive candidate come out and say at least two things. One is we should exclude people from Muslim countries from coming in because some of them have this ideology. And number two, if we'd had more people with guns in that nightclub, there wouldn't have been as bad a tragedy. What's your reaction to that?
Did you see how dark it was?
Yes. In the club?
I think it's likely that more people would have been killed. All I know is this. We had a 10-year ban on assault weapons. That was passed when I was president. I signed it, and we pushed hard for it. And no small number of members of Congress lost their jobs because they voted for that and for what was then a comprehensive background check law. We had a 33-year low in the gun death rate and a 46-year low in total illegal deaths by gun homicides. In other words, it worked pretty well. And then, you know, when it was allowed to expire, for a while we didn't seem to have an uptick in crime. But if you look at what happened with these big weapons at Sandy Hook and Aurora, Colorado, and most recently in Orlando and San Bernardino, it's pretty clear that if you're firing a lot of weapons, a lot of ammunition in a short amount of time, with a weapon that's designed only to kill, more people will die than if you're stuck with a pistol. If the guy had just had a pistol in that nightclub, I don't think anybody believes he could possibly have killed 49 people. So that's my response.
So let's talk about the CGI America initiative. And We understand generally about how it works, but I want to be specific because there's one particular initiative that came out of the meetings last year here in Detroit. As you know, I'm from Michigan.
Yeah.
I've just been back to Detroit, visiting Detroit. Take us through that initiative having to do with mortgages and housing in Detroit and how it worked.
Well, first of all, Detroit was in a unique situation because it was coming out of bankruptcy. It had a vigorous new mayor, Mike Duggan. He really wanted to help people move downtown in a hurry. And when he became mayor, he was in effect in control of more than 50% of the land mass of downtown Detroit. Some of the property needed to be raised and cleared because they could use more green space and because it didn't seem likely that anyone would come back to live there. But there were 10,000, he found 10,000 structurally sound, habitable structures. And a lot of people were willing to move back downtown because they wanted to help Detroit come back. But they all needed repairs. The banks that would issue the mortgage had to value the homes based not only on their structure, some of them are quite magnificent even, but not only on their structural potential, but on the fact that they were in neighborhoods where every other house was vacant. So people who were willing to move downtown and couldn't afford to both buy the home and repair it needed to have more mortgage help than any bank could legally give them on a first mortgage. So, you know, the mayor talked about it, and I have a real interest in Detroit and wanted to help. And physically located close to each other in Detroit, and some were from out of town. And they just put their heads together for 3 days, and they came up with this idea of how a second mortgage could be issued that would enable the homeowner to make the home habitable, and that the repayment could be structured in a way that would not cripple them financially. And that's what we did, and it's going to put 1,000 more people in homes, and I think it'll be the beginning of something that may well have application in other distressed areas in the United States, and I hope so.
What was it that had failed that didn't allow this to happen? I mean, it wouldn't have happened, as I understand it, without the CGI America. It would not have happened. I mean, well-meaning people could not have gotten together. What is it? What's the failure in that?
Well, I think it's not so much a failure as you shouldn't. It's almost impossible in a big, complex society with a zillion things happening at once to set up a system that foresees every potential breakdown or every potential problem. You know, if we'd never had the financial crash, maybe these banks could have thought they had enough slack from regulators to do something that they clearly, under strictest conditions, shouldn't have done. So now they couldn't do it. So we figured out how to basically close a gap in the fabric of our housing market. And that's really what I was trying to do when I set up my foundation 15 years ago. I just wanted to figure out how to solve problems faster, better, at lower cost than they would otherwise be solved. And I saw this a lot. There's a great deal of difference between passing a law and changing lives. There's a great deal of difference even between appropriating money and changing lives. You have to know how to do things. And I think that the more complex and interdependent our society gets, the more premium we will put on people who find a way to answer the how question. And we find, and have for years, that if you get groups of people with diverse experience and expertise who just want to get a job done and don't really care about what their politics are or anything else, they're just trying to get a job done, more often than not, you'll find a way to do it faster, better, at lower cost.
As you say, you have a track record now. You have a body of work. What have you learned over those years about what sorts of problems particularly can be addressed, solved by this sort of cooperative effort, and which ones really don't fit so well?
Well, let's start with the second category. There are some things that require, if you will, a threshold level of investment from either the private sector or government, without which you can't do what you'd like to do. I'll give you an example. You told me you were from Flint.
I am.
Flint is nowhere near the only city in America where children have elevated blood levels in their blood. We've done what we could to help Flint, but it would take a national commitment to a real serious infrastructure program to take up all the rusty pipes in America and give all the kids in our country a healthy future. Be a very good investment. Interest rates are lower than inflation now. Would create a lot of jobs and have a good income. There would still be particular problems in particular places we could help, but that's a threshold thing. We can now, because solar and wind power are relatively cheap and dramatically cheaper than they were a few years ago, we can help to put together coalitions to accelerate the income benefits as well as the climate benefits of solar and wind power in many places. But if, for example, you want to help the poorest Americans who are still Native Americans living on Indian lands without casinos, a lot of them could be making a fortune out of this, but they can't afford the transmission lines to carry the power from where they are to any place that's strong enough to receive it. So those are the things you can't do. The things you can do largely involve getting people to rethink what they're doing and see if they can be faithful to their responsibilities with their assets and do it in a way with more social benefits. I'll give you an example. I could give you lots, but just one quick one is, I was having a conversation 5 years ago with the president of the AFL-CIO, Rich Trumka, in Davos, of all places. I think it's the last time I was there. And I said, you know, labor's under a lot of stress, but you don't have to play victim here. You need to play offense. And I think you should consider taking your well-funded public pension funds and investing money in infrastructure projects, especially energy retrofits, that will put a lot of union workers to work in the private sector and pension funds. And he just chewed on it and put me in touch with some people, and Randy Weingarten at the AFT wound up taking the lead with the North American Building Trades group, and we got $10 billion in commitments to do this. Now their commitment is $14 billion. $14.5 billion has been allocated, about 12.5 has actually been deployed, spent, and more than 100,000 jobs have been created doing these infrastructure and building retrofit projects. It's done a world of good, created a lot of jobs. The public pension funds have been totally faithful, the trustees have, because they're going to get a decent return on this. And that's the kind of thing we just think about all the time. How can you do something differently? Coca-Cola is one of the hosts of this CGI America. They joined with PepsiCo. They're big.
How about that? How about that?
Yeah, and Cadbury Schweppes and other big producers of both soft drinks and fruit juice. And they agreed to change what they were putting in the drinks going to children in our schools, both in the vending machines and in the cafeterias. And with voluntary agreement, they reduced, according to 2 different independent studies, they reduced the calories going to kids in schools by 90%. That's the kind of stuff I try to get people to do here.
So given that track record, given those accomplishments, looking forward to what I think you probably expect and hope will happen next November, what happens to your initiative, Clinton Global Initiative, if your wife is president?
Well, I think right now I just want to say what Hillary did. We'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. If she wins, we'll have to think about it. There are clearly, politics is different from what I do. I mean, I just try to get partners together and make something good happen. The government should do more of that. The president has tried to involve more people from the private sector in a lot of his decision making. But you have to be careful to avoid actual or potential conflicts of interest.
Well, that's the issue, because people have raised that. Even Donald Trump's raised that and things like that. And lots of things get raised, but it gets dicier if your wife is president.
We'll think very clearly about it, and we'll do the right thing. We'll try to and explain it to the American people. But I'll have to wait. First, I don't believe in counting your chickens before they hatch, and so let's see how this election unfolds. But there'll clearly be some changes in what the Clinton Foundation does and how we do it, and we'll just have to cross that bridge when we come to it.
So talking about the election a bit, I mean, you served as president for 8 years, and there was a fair amount of heated rhetoric, I think it's fair to say, back and forth and up and down. But what we're seeing in this election strikes me at least as having a level of personal attack involved. And it's not uniquely on the Republican side. There have been some candidates on the Democratic side as well. Is this a permanent change in the political discourse in this country, or is this an aberration?
I don't know. It's easier to say things that don't make a lick of sense now, because so many of our people are siloed in their information. That is, I tell people all the time, and notwithstanding that terrible incident in Orlando, we are less racist, sexist, and homophobic than we used to be. We just are. We're becoming a more inclusive society. Our one remaining bigotry is we do not want to be around anyone who disagrees with us, either actually or virtually. So we are, if you get into a silo like that, you're prone to believe anything that your preconceived prejudice would allow. And that's not good for us. That's why one of the reasons that I like all these CGI events, because people here come from every political perspective. They make a living in different ways. Their whole experience base is different. And they find it quite stimulating to be with people who are different from them. And they find that what we know, which is that diverse groups make better decisions than lone geniuses, much less a group of totally like-thinking people. So I think we just have to be super sensitive to that and keep looking for ways to break out of our silos, because fundamentally people are pretty decent. But I do think if you look around the world, a lot of these campaigns have gotten harsher and harsher, in part because of the long drag after the crash. So you've got, in many places, a combination of stagnant incomes and disruptive threats to people's identity. In Europe, you had the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. And you had a contest between walls and bridges in Austria, which has a very solid economy and still a pretty close contest. And I think you have a lot of people who, if they go a long time thinking that they can't make their tomorrows better and they can't give their kids a better future, they feel consciously or subconsciously that the world disrespects them, disregards them, or doesn't see them. So then they're less offended if somebody else is getting the kind of treatment they think daily life gives them. I think that we all need to be a lot more sensitive to that. We need to be more sensitive to what our neighbors are going through. And I think if we did that, slowly we would change the culture back to where our politics was a little more humane and disciplined.
Yeah, I want to talk about the economy and growing the economy, but before that, one last point on the election. It strikes me that one of the things that's been injected this time is questioning the opponent's qualifications even to serve. It's one thing to say I disagree with them. It's another thing to say I'd be better than they would be, but to say they shouldn't even be considered for office. You have held the office. You have special qualifications. As you look at it, what should be the qualifications we're looking for in a candidate, whether they're Republican or they're Democrat?
Well, first of all, that's a decision that the voters make at every election, and different people serve better at different times. I was well suited to be president when I was elected because I was the senior governor in terms of service in America, and my state had one of the fastest growing economies in the country and had a big improvement in the things that America needed to improve on, including education and employment in hard industries like manufacturing. And because I knew what people were up against. But I think at a minimum you want someone who loves the country, believes that we are not just a place, we're an idea, that we really do believe we're born to welcome people from every place who love freedom, believe in the rule of law, and respect other people's right to play out their destiny. And then someone with a proven record of being able to do that. And then, you have other rules that develop over time that we think are required. But the voters ultimately decide that. They decide who's qualified. But I think my job is to support one particular candidate who I think is the most qualified person in America to serve at this particular time. Because now we need someone who basically understands how the federal government can add a couple of points to economic growth, can make, more importantly, prosperity more widely shared to reduce inequality and increase upward mobility, and can break political gridlock in Washington and give us the space we need to grow. Our economic fate now is pretty well tied up also with what happens in the rest of the world. In the last quarter's economic report, there was a great piece of good news. For the first time since the crash, more than 61 cents on the dollar of corporate revenues was going to pay in other compensation. It was about 62.5 cents. Wages starting to rise. And then a piece of bad news, which is that in spite of the brisk hiring of several months, our growth had dropped back to 0.5%, due entirely to what's happening around the world. Brazil, China slowing down, pressures in Southeast Asia, all these things that are going on, and what's happening in Europe. So I think, it's not an easy job right now, but it's a doable one. It's not so difficult to determine. What we should do is to pick people with the skill sets to do it.
Well, that's exactly what I want to ask.
Good day from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. I'm Mark Crumpton. We're interrupting our interview with former President Bill Clinton with my colleague David Westin at the Clinton Global Initiative in Atlanta. President Obama is set to speak on terrorism. He is at the U.S. Treasury Department. Before we go to that event, let's go to my colleague Angela Greiling-Keene, who's been following this story today. Angela, given the events in Orlando, given what happened last night outside of Paris, the authorities there believe that a man who had allegiance to Islamic State was responsible for the death of a police official and his wife. What can the president say today that may allay people